Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the inaugural Progress Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Woodie Kessel, and along with Joe Richardson, my esteemed colleague, we have the privilege of co-directing Progress, and Progress is an acronym because it's something we want to achieve. We want to prevent gun violence through research, empowerment, strategies, and solutions. It's an important initiative established at the University of Maryland in response to the epidemic of gun violence in our country. Nearly 134 fatalities from gun violence occur every day in this country. And that's why University of Maryland President Darrell Pines established the Progress Initiative. We're not only grateful to President Pines and support, but particularly the support of Provost Jennifer King Rice, Dean Rivera of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, Dean Lushniak from the School of Public Health, and certainly Vice President Greg Ball. We thank you all for recognizing this as a grand challenge of our times and frankly taking action at the university to do something about it. Progress's key objective is to reduce gun violence through a multidisciplinary, community-based, and translational science approach. Our goal is frankly to save lives. We also are pleased to be able to bring together the strengths and assets across the University of Maryland. And this distinguished speaker initiative is part of that mission to share important scholarship with the community writ large. As we begin, I just want to note that all of the participant microphones and Zoom chat function are disabled. And this session is being recorded, so you should be aware of all of that. In order to facilitate the question and answers, the Zoom function Q&A at the bottom of your screen, most of your screens, please use that to pose a question one at a time and identify the speaker to whom your question is to be directed. Dr. Richardson will share the questions that appear in the Q&A and direct the speaker to respond to them. We're going to save all the Q&As to the end after all the extraordinary presentations. Thanks again for joining us today, and Joe, please introduce our distinguished guests and speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Kessel. Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Progress Initiative, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this inaugural Progress Distinguished Speaker Series event. As Dr. Kessel briefly mentioned, we believe that one of the greatest strengths of Progress is our focus on community empowerment through translational science, as well as our multidisciplinary approach to research, which draws, analyzes, and applies data from multiple sectors, including public health and the criminal justice and legal systems. Today, we are honored to sponsor presentations by two exceptional University of Maryland scholar practitioners, Professor Rabiatu Barrie and Professor Brooklynn Hitchens, whom I will introduce shortly. But first, to help inaugurate this speaker series, we are delighted to be joined by two distinguished representatives of UMD's leadership, Vice President for Research, Gregory Ball, and Dean Susan Rivera. Dr. Ball serves as Vice President for Research for the University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland, Baltimore. In this capacity, he oversees a joint research enterprise that ranks among the top 10 public institutions in the US in research expenditures, and which garners $1.3 billion in research awards annually. A noted researcher, Dr. Ball maintains a lab in the UMD's Department of Psychology and served as Dean of the university's College of Behavioral and Social Sciences from 2014 to 2022. During his deanship, Dr. Ball took an active interest in and lent key support for research on gun violence reduction, and related topics. Dr. Ball, we thank you for your support and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson, for that very generous introduction. And I want to personally thank you for all you have done for the University of Maryland community and indeed the state of Maryland and beyond in articulating and attacking this terrible problem. I am pleased, very pleased, to be part of this event today to help launch the Progress Distinguished Speaker Series. Progress was launched last fall in response to the epidemic of gun violence in communities across our nation. Gun violence continues to be one of the most serious problems facing our time. And as a land-grant university, the University of Maryland is committed to helping our society address the impact of this violence and its effects on our society. The Progress Initiative will advance education, scholarship, cutting-edge research with actionable gun violence prevention solutions. The Progress Distinguished Speaker Series will help educate students, faculty, and our community to learn about cutting-edge research that can be translated into life-saving actions. Progress helps tackle the grand challenge of gun violence, in part by working with our talented faculty and students in College Park. Progress is also working with partners in our region and across the nation, supporting communities to take action to help stop this epidemic. As Dr. Richardson noted, we have two distinguished University of Maryland scholars, Professor Rabiatu Barrie in the Family Science Department in the School of Public Health, and Professor Brooklynn Hitchens in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice and Behavioral and Social Sciences. And I look forward to hearing their groundbreaking research. Thank you all for joining us today to learn from these presentations. And with that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Richardson.
Thank you so very much, Vice President Ball. Now, on behalf of Progress, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Susan Rivera. Dr. Rivera has served as Dean of UMD's College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, or also known as BSOS, since August 2022. As Dean, she promotes a culture of impactful research and scholarship, encourages interdisciplinary collaboration and partnerships, and advocates persuasively for BSOS programs both within and beyond the campus community. Dean Rivera works with faculty, staff, and students to articulate a vision for the contributions BSOS will make to the fulfillment of the university's mission and new strategic plan. Her research is focused on investigating brain structure and function in both neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, including those with autism, Down syndrome, and the Fragile X spectrum of involvement. On behalf of Dr. Kessel and myself and the entire Progress team, I would like to take this opportunity to offer special thanks and acknowledgement to Dean Rivera for her steadfast support for the initiative and our work. Dean Rivera, we are very grateful that Progress has found a collegial, empowered, and empowering home base in BSOS, where we consistently receive outstanding support at all levels, times, and quarters. Welcome, Dean Susan Rivera.
Thank you, Joe, for that really generous introduction. I'm very appreciative and very, very proud of Progress. And thank you, Vice President Ball and my predecessor for helping lead off this important new speaker series. I'm so honored to join you today to share my perspective on the absolutely critical issue of gun violence reduction. So the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences works to increase understanding of and create innovative solutions, as was mentioned before, to the challenges facing our communities. That's locally, nationally, and globally. Now, Progress was launched, as it was before mentioned, last fall in partnership with President Pines in response to the epidemic of gun violence in the U.S. This is undeniably one of the most devastating problems our country faces today. BSOS maintains a strong commitment to Progress and the issues it addresses. The college encompasses several disciplines and fields of study that are directly relevant to gun violence and gun violence prevention. And the launch of Progress Initiative provides a really amazing hub for our researchers to work together to really address this epidemic. My own professional background, which was mentioned, working to better understand the function of the human brain in health and in illness, is certainly intertwined with the scientific pursuit to reduce gun violence. The Progress Initiative echoes the BSOS's mission to advance education, cutting-edge research, scholarship, and actionable, really important word, actionable solutions. In short, to be the solution to the world's great challenges. This new Progress Distinguished Speaker Series is really going to help highlight the kind of groundbreaking research that can inform these practical solutions. The mission of Progress, to save lives, can be best achieved by working with our talented faculty and students here in College Park and across our region and across the nation to support communities and to take action to stop this epidemic. So thank you very much for having me as a guest. I'm very honored and I'm very proud. And now I will turn the floor back over to Dr. Joseph Richarson.
Thank you so much, Dean Rivera. One of the core goals of Progress is to help shape the scope and tempo of gun violence reduction efforts now and well into the future. By working closely with the next generation and early career scholars and practitioners engaged in pioneering and impactful research and community outreach. From this perspective, the choice of Professors Barrie and Hitchens to serve as our featured speakers for this inaugural Distinguished Speaker Series event was obvious. We will hear first from Professor Barrie, then from Professor Hitchens, and after the two presentations, we will have a question and answer period. As noted earlier by Dr. Kessel, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A function at any time to share a question. To facilitate the Q&A, please identify the speaker to whom your question should be addressed in the first instance, and I'll select and share as many questions as possible in the allotted time. Our lead-off featured speaker, Professor Rabiatu Barrie, is a child psychologist with over 10 years of clinical experience treating youth and their families who have experienced interpersonal and community violence trauma. As an intervention science scholar and practitioner, she develops interventions to address the outcomes of the interactions between race, gender, and trauma. She is specifically interested in the processes of gendered racial socialization of African-American boys and how the messages that they receive about manhood impact their identity, development, their experience of traumatic stress, including racialized stress, risky behaviors such as gun violence, and academic outcomes such as persistence and self-efficacy. Dr. Barrie holds an appointment of assistant professor in the Family Science Department in the School of Public Health here at UMD. She is also director and principal investigator of the Black Love Through Advocacy for Children and Kinfolk, also known as Black Health Research Lab. Professor Barrie, welcome, and please take the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen. All right, so good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my talk, Gender Racialized Trauma, Masculinity as a Risk Factor for African-American Men. So here's the agenda again: define and contextualize gender racialized trauma, discuss how the expression of masculine norms puts African-American men at risk, discuss the cost to African-American men in navigating cultural and hegemonic expressions of manhood, and then we'll talk about some of my interventions that I'm developing. All right, so during the pandemic, in the midst of the George Floyd aftermath, Dave Chappelle gave his commentary on his Netflix special, and he said, "Any expletive, N-word, who survives this nightmare is my expletive hero." All right, so this quote is really a raw reflection on the specific and unique institutional and systemic violence that Black men in America navigate in their lives. And so this presentation is more of a maybe academic conversation that is, reflected in this quote. So what is gender racialized trauma? I'm going to break it down into two parts. So racialized trauma is the cumulative effect of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. Racialized trauma is general and doesn't necessarily account for the way that gender intersects and interacts with race to produce unique results for, in this case, Black men. Right? So when we think about the intersection of gender and race, intersectionality as a construct at its core and its original purpose was to outline the compounding effects of people who hold marginalized identities, such as being Black and being a woman, right? And so it's very much this, comparison of marginalized versus privileged identities. And we understand, Black as a marginalized identity, so we know how racism systemically perpetuates anti-Blackness. However, maleness is generally considered a privileged identity that's associated with advantages in being at the top of the social hierarchy based solely on being male, right? So, but then the question becomes, what happens to the privilege of maleness when Black is added to it, right? So when Black is added to it, it's re-envisioned and repackaged and assigned a new set of rules. And so ultimately then, the privilege that was once assigned to maleness is essentially eliminated in the areas that matter, in the areas that matter, right? So gendered racialized trauma speaks to the fact that there's a unique way in which African-American men experience racism and marginalization that's specific to them as people who are both Black and male because they are Black and male, right? And so these experiences are chronic and they persist across the lifespan. So the cycle of dehumanization framework by Howard Stevenson and Rhonda Soyafat out of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation really provide an understanding for the gendered racialized trauma of Black men. So dehumanization is the persistent invalidation of humanity through perceptions or actual treatment. So there are 5 kind of areas of dehumanization in this model, and I won't go into them for the sake of time, but instead I'll discuss kind of the general principle of dehumanization, beginning with the negative narratives, right? So the negative narratives are historical and intergenerational. So when we think of some of those historical narratives, is that Black men are brute savages, that they're criminals, that they're unintelligent, they're players of women, thought of as like hustlers and schemers and scammers, and that they had this like exceptional athleticism, right? This list is not exhaustive, but these are some of the negative narratives that are historical and intergenerational. And the narratives place limits on the respectful human dignity and affirming treatment from society towards Black men, right? It places limits on what society thinks they can achieve, on the access to the resources they think that they should have. It, in essence, presents their very existence as problems that need to be solved, right? And those narratives provide rationale, right, for the harmful and violent actions, both interpersonal and institutional, towards Black men. So some examples are the school to prison pipeline, racial profiling, disproportionate school discipline, overemphasis on athletic skill, and media representation of sexual prowess, right? So then those intergenerational, like prolonged exposure to these narratives, and then the dangerous actions towards them can result in the internalization of these messages, right? And so it impacts the way that they see themselves and the way that they develop their identities, right? So we think about things like self-efficacy. Do they believe that they can move willfully towards something and achieve a goal? Do they feel like they have any control over their life, or are they just subject to the things that happen to them externally, right? We call that an external locus of control. And when you internalize these messages and these feelings, and they impact you in this way, they oftentimes can result in disruptive external reactions. And so I have traumatic stress here, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and disturbed mood, because generally we think of those as kind of like in psychology as internalizing disorders, so things that you feel internally. But because of the way that traumatic stress manifests in men and the way we accept from men how they should express their feelings and their internalized experiences, a lot of times we see those as external reactions, right? In things such as rage, aggression, and, thinking of, the focus of progress up into homicide, right? And so when these internalized messages manifest into destructive and risky behaviors, they lead to negative outcomes, right? So Black men have the highest incarceration rates, the highest unemployment rates, highest rates of school suspension. Our boys have the highest rates of diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. as well as ADHD, right? And so then these negative outcomes reinforce the negative narratives from history, right? And then it becomes this cycle, right, which then justifies the dangerous actions, internalization of messages, so on and so forth, right? So this dehumanization model is really an explanation for how gender racialized trauma happens. So germane to understanding how the dehumanization cycle impacts Black men is understanding the masculine norms that they negotiate day to day. And so social science has given some attention to how hegemonic or dominant manhood norms, and when we say hegemonic, that means kind of what is society's overall expectation. Some people might call that like white masculinity. So social sciences has talked about how hegemonic or dominant manhood norms impact Black men, and they offer an explanation for why Black men are overrepresented in many negative outcomes, such as neighborhood violence. So I have here some hegemonic and Afrocultural manhood norms. I'll discuss the hegemonic norms first. So I'm only going to discuss a couple, starting with Puritan patriarchy. So Puritan patriarchy is really a reference to the historical nature of manhood in America, where the first requirement of manhood was being Anglo and being Protestant. And it established the myth of meritocracy, whereas any man can have material wealth and success if they work hard enough. And then power and control. Power and control ideology says that men should and they should desire to exert their will over their environment for personal gain. Anti-femininity and emotional restriction are kind of face valid. And I'm going to move to the provider ideology, mostly because they are the tenets most often mentioned in the literature as being elusive for Black men. So the provider ideology is the idea that it's synonymous with being a breadwinner. So manhood is diminished if you one, don't make a lot of money, two, don't make more money than your partner, or three, don't have enough money to take care of your wife and children. So being the provider and breadwinner in your family is hallmark to kind of dominant manhood norms versus manhood development in African American culture tends to be more relational. So one's manhood is earned through rites of passage outlined through the community, such as displaying pro-social behaviors as a child, handling responsibilities in your family, like being helpful to one's parents, older family members, obtaining gainful employment, getting married, being responsible and a good example for your family and your community, as well as making decisions as a leader, making good decisions as a leader that benefit your family, right? So the quality of man is judged more by his ability to relate to his community, and identity and self-development are means for taking care of their community. And so both of these sets of norms exist for Black men to operate within, but the question is, how do they operate for them, right? So in the kind of general consensus in the literature is that Black men's lack of agency, lack of ability to access benefits of capitalism, inability to fully express and enjoy the privileges of hegemonic masculinity, failed access and expression of manhood is why Black men turn to maladaptive behaviors to cope and make up the difference on the scale and sphere within they reside and they have influence, right? So the idea is that rage, toughness, violence, criminality, selling of drugs, the cool persona, hypermasculinity are all reactions to their oppressed condition and their inability to access manhood. Right? The idea is that manhood is tenuous, and so they work hard to obtain and earn it any way that they can within the bounds that they have available to them. And I really do understand that conceptualization. It does make sense, but in my therapeutic and scholarly work, I found that Black men aren't actually reactionary, but are very pensive and proactive about the way they approach manhood. So I contend that Black men have not actually failed at manhood in navigating hegemonic masculine norms. It's interesting, even as a consideration, that the men who were stolen from their homeland, forced into servitude, and managed to survive and thrive in this nation, would have issues with, making necessary adaptations. I think they proved that they're able to do so. The issue is, they do hegemonic masculinity just fine. The issue is that when they engage in hegemonic masculine ways, they're punished for it. Violence and criminality are the American way, right? So using guns, exerting control over others and over your environment is the part of the American way, right? So here we have Donald Trump and Jay-Z. And I chose a younger picture of Donald Trump because as difficult as it may be, I want us to think of who he was before 2016, right? So we know in his business practices, you know, he filed for bankruptcy multiple times. He's infamous for not paying contractors, for abandoning jobs. He has other fraudulent business practices. He's been accused, he was accused then and has been found responsible now of abusing women, right? But people believed and still believe that he's a pillar of manhood. And it's really that manhood that won him the 2016 election, right? But then we think about Jay-Z, he did the same thing. He employed people, right? When he was selling drugs and he stole and he did these things, he employed people, right? But then he used that money to build a business from scratch. And he literally turned his entire life around and the life of his loved ones for the better, right? And to my knowledge, you know, he hasn't engaged in any kind of fraudulent current business practices. But in America, on the whole, maybe other than the Black community, people would still think of him as a stereotype, as a gangster, as a thug, as a criminal, right? But really, what's different about them, right? And Jay-Z, in essence, really started from the bottom, right? And now he's a billionaire. So for all intents and purposes, he has a bootstrap story, but he wouldn't necessarily be described that way. And celebrities really aren't the only ones, right? So there's plenty of literature that talks about how Black men must navigate the workplace to not appear too strong, too ambitious, which is oftentimes interpreted as aggression, all in all threatening. Behaviors that, when exhibited by their white counterparts, are lauded and promoted, right? And what about our youth? Our youth don't get to be youth, right? Because when we look at these two photos, they would be interpreted very differently by onlookers, even though they're literally the exact same photo, right? So it isn't what, but who that is the issue as it relates to the expression of masculinity norms, right? And this is not to say that hegemonic and Afrocultural norms are diametrically opposed. There are norms that overlap, but at the same time are qualitatively different, right? So this list is not exhaustive by any means. Really the goal of this slide is to help you see the complexity of the navigation between norms, right? So independence and self-reliance are both important tenets of manhood for both hegemonic and Afrocultural norms. And in fact, they're actually usually the top answer in studies where men are asked about manhood. The difference really is in the goal and purpose of said independence. So the collectivistic and relational nature of African-American culture really promotes independence and self-reliance for the purpose of one excelling and then coming back to the community to share what they've obtained. While the provider and protector, another tenet of manhood that is high on the list of what men name as central to manhood, compared to hegemonic norms where provider is synonymous with breadwinner, African-American men have a much more expanded definition of what it means to be a provider. In addition to the financial provision, it includes being an emotional incubator for their families, being selfless and self-sacrificial, and protecting their families from external threats, including racism. And stoicism and emotional restriction are really about not letting people know what they're feeling because they feel like they'll lose ground in protecting themselves, which means they leave their families vulnerable, right? And it also can serve as a way to protect the community from perpetuation of negative narratives. So even if there's a situation where a Black man should be upset or should be angry, he might not express that anger and show that anger out loud because he doesn't want to perpetuate the stereotype that Black men are angry and aggressive, right? So instead he'd remain stoic. So, you know, Black men have to operate within two spaces. They have to operate within hegemonic masculine norms, but they also have to operate within norms that are appropriate for their cultural group. And, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois coined this as double consciousness, right? The idea that Black men experience themselves through their own consciousness, as well as through their awareness of how they're supposed to participate in dominant norms, right? There's a conscious and subconscious straddling of masculine norm expression. And so this navigating and straddling of masculinity norms and the kind of unpredictable outcomes in that navigation has cost to African-American men. So Harrison Kruger found in their study that adolescent African-American boys that, you know, think about their racial public regard impacts their pro-social behaviors. So racial public regard is basically how one thinks others think about their race. And in their study, the more positively that the youth thought that others thought of their race, the more likely they were to engage in pro-social behaviors. And the same pattern held for gender. So the better that they thought others thought about their gender, the better they thought about their gender, they were more likely to behave in pro-social ways, which means the opposite is also true, right? So the less regard they have for their own group, the less likely they are to engage in pro-social behaviors, right? So it speaks to the internalization of messages and how those messages impact the psychological well-being of Black boys who will eventually become Black men. The constant code switching and unpredictability of gender racial traumatic experiences uses a lot of psychological energy and causes stress. And Black men across SES, so no matter if they're poor, middle class, or wealthy, are more likely to develop and die from stress-related illnesses like heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. A hallmark of traumatic stress, chronic traumatic stress especially, is a poor outlook on the future, hopelessness, lack of self-efficacy, which is basically an individual's belief, again, in their capacity to execute behaviors to produce specific outcomes. So when you don't think that you're going to live very long, or you can't see a productive future for yourself, you're more likely to engage in risky behaviors. And risky behaviors tend to have poor outcomes, such as early death. And when we think about some of the norms like independence and self-reliance, which are both pillars of dominant hegemonic masculinity norms, as well as Afrocultural norms, it impacts their help-seeking behavior, right? So in recent years, we've begun to see a shift, but by and large, Black men do not seek help, whether it be social service help, help from friends and family, or help from service providers, right? They will offer and give help, but they don't ask for it, even when they are very clearly struggling. And even in the event that they do kind of work through that self-reliance enough to seek help, the stoicism and emotional restriction becomes a barrier to treatment engagement. So when we think about mental health treatment, the very nature of therapy is to delve into and be present in one's emotions. And that can be extremely challenging, right? When you've had to internalize a stoic and non-emotive way of being for your, very survival, right, in the United States. So kind of what are some ways that we can address and intervene and address the dehumanization of Black men? I'm glad that you asked. So these are two of my many projects that my research lab is working on. So the first one is promoting resilience and identity development through empowerment, acronym for PRIDE. It's a 9-module curriculum that I developed to deconstruct stereotypical roles of Black men. The goal is to help African-American boys develop the scripts and narratives about Black men that they want to be, and dispel this notion that they must earn their masculinity through the expression of stereotypes and dominant norms of masculinity. Basically, the overall goal is for them to learn that they're men because they say they are, and they get to decide what kind of men they want to be. So I'm currently implementing this at a local high school here in Greenbelt, and would love to also do a community implementation through different community organizations. So if you're interested or know anyone who's interested, please contact us. And then the second one is the Acute Family Treatment Emergency Reparation Intervention, also known as AFTER. It's a hospital-based family intervention for youth who've been injured by gunshot. This study is funded through UMD as part of President Pine's Grand Challenges Initiative. It aims to do acute therapeutic interventions with youth and their families while they're in the hospital after gunshot injury to decrease the development of traumatic stress symptoms and prepare them to return to the community after violent injury. And these are just two of the many studies that I'm doing. So I'm also doing studies about Black youth's endorsement of male role norms and an interview study whose purpose is to understand how Black fathers and caretakers socialize their sons about Black masculinity and coping with racism. And we are knee-deep in recruitment. So if you or anyone you know is a Black man with a son between the ages of 12 and 17, we would love to have them in our study. So in conclusion, the dehumanization of Black men makes their masculinity a risk factor for negative outcomes, right? And the reality of it is we really pay a lot of attention to these outcomes, but not enough inquiry or analysis into the individual and group experiences of Black men, particularly the cost to Black men across domains over the course of their lifespan, right? Black men are operating within multiple cultural norms simultaneously and, have done remarkably well, all things considered, right? So Black masculinity is complex and layered and should be included really in any work that's considering any other outcomes related to Black men. And it's important to understand that Black men are not helpless victims, right? They are agents, they have agency, and our work and our focus should also be on pro-social values of Black men and Black manhood and engage in the affirmation and promotion of those values in manhood, and really should be the focus and the main focus of intervention and prevention programming when working with Black men and their families. So this is my lab. Thank you for your attention. And this is our contact information. Thank you to Progress and Dr. Richardson, who's such a great example of how to do this work and do it well. And Dr. Kessel, who has a wealth of wisdom from his work as a physician, where he treated many individuals who experienced violent injury. So that's my spiel, and I'm gonna send it back to you, Dr. Richardson.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Barrie. It's such an insightful presentation. We look forward to all of the incisive questions that your presentation has generated, and we'll return to those questions shortly after the presentation by Dr. Hitchens. So for our next featured speaker, Dr. Brooklynn Hitchens is an assistant professor in UMD's Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. She is a sociologist and critical criminologist who investigates how inequalities of race, class, and gender shape participation in crime, risk for victimization, and involvement with police. Using participatory action research methods, also known as PAR, she partners with low-income Black communities to reduce racial disparities in gun violence. Professor Hitchens' methodological expertise is qualitative through the use of ethnography, interviews, and focus groups, and she also utilizes quantitative and mixed methods. Her core areas of interest include urban gun violence and trauma, women in crime, race, class, and gender inequalities in crime and victimization, and hard-to-reach populations. Welcome, Professor Hitchens.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen. All right. Joe, could you tell me really fast and make sure we can see this? We can see this, right?
I can see it. We clean it up, Black female homicide survivorship in context.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
We're good.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Progress, for the opportunity to share my ongoing mixed method work on how street-identified Black women and girls navigate urban inequality and precarity while being involved in the streets and criminal justice system. So Dr. Barrie did a great job of laying the foundation, right, of how racialized trauma shapes the behavioral worldviews of low-income Black boys and men, and how that context of trauma leads to the escalation of urban violence. But today I discuss an oft-forgotten side of urban violence, the fallout and aftermath of the violence. So I'll share a snapshot from my upcoming second book project with a presentation, as you can see, titled, "We Clean It Up, Black Female Homicide Survivorship in Context." But first, some CDC homicide trends, right? As we all know, homicide is a dire public health crisis in Black communities. It is a social problem and an uneven burden that has persisted for decades and is truly emblematic of the complex forms of structural racism and inequality. Black Americans continue to experience the highest gun homicide rates in every age group, with homicide being the leading cause of death for Black men and boys ages 15 to 34. We know that Black women are far less likely to be direct victims of gun violence than are Black men, but data consistently indicate that firearm homicide is the second leading cause of death for Black women and girls ages 15 to 24. Black women die by gun homicide at rates that exceed all other women, along with white, Hispanic, and Asian men. In addition, recent data suggests that more Black women and girls are getting shot in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Chicago for a few significant reasons. One, women are much more involved in the escalation of urban violence than we recognize. Two, intimate partner violence. And 3, to a lesser extent, random and/or stray bullets. So there's this often untold narrative of Black women's experiences with direct personal victimization. Part of this is due to, as I said, the sheer volume of violent death that Black men experience. Each of these men were tragically killed by guns in Wilmington, Delaware. But there's another missing piece here. Not only are Black women direct victims of violence, they are also vicarious or indirect victims. In their social proximity to Black men and boys, they are the mothers and mates, the daughters and the siblings who are left behind when the men in their lives are killed by guns. So my work interrogates these complex issues by asking, how does a violent phenomenon that disproportionately injures Black men also harm the lives and well-being of Black women? And what can we gain by expanding how we understand gun violence to include the experiences of street-identified Black women and girls? Despite a growing literature on gun victimization in marginalized Black communities, less attention has been paid to the collateral consequences of family, peers, and community members who were left behind after someone is shot and killed. We identify these individuals as homicide survivors, or similarly co-victims, who vicariously experience or witness the loss of a loved one to homicide, and they survive the experience. Rough estimates suggest that each homicide impacts 3 to 10 loved ones, but we truly do not yet know the scale of homicide survivorship in Black communities. Part of this is due to substantive gaps in the literature. Empirically, we know far less about the complex health-related and criminogenic outcomes of Black women and girls who are homicide survivors. This is often because methodologically, we fail to access, recruit, and sample hard-to-reach populations of women who may be involved in illegal activities, fear confrontation with law or legal authorities, or experience various forms of economic or social precarity. Much of the work on homicide survivorship is qualitative as well. In addition, we lack a robust theoretical analysis on gendered and racialized vicarious trauma and how street life operates as a site of resilience in low-income Black spaces. A deeper, more uncomfortable theoretical reality is that assaultive violence in Black communities is reflective of broader forms of intentional, structural, and cultural violence. In my own work, I engage necropolitics and slow violence to understand how violent Black death, is disregarded in mainstream media and in the academy. Black people are rendered a throwaway people in the minds of many, an expendable and disposable people whose victimization is expected. Galtung's concept of cultural violence underscores the collective apathy we have for violent Black death. Cultural violence legitimizes the suffering of Black people. Criminologist Elliot Curry calls this a peculiar indifference. And Black women and girls are hyper-visible, yet hyper-invisible in this social reality. They shoulder the brunt and stress of community violence, literally and figuratively. And I've shown this photo in other presentations, but it continues to be so powerful. So much of urban gun violence is discussed, but not felt. Last summer, I spoke with 2 female violence interrupters in Philadelphia who have both experienced their fair shares of loss. After discussing a recent shooting they witnessed, I asked one of them, I said, how long did it take for firefighters or city workers to come and clean up the mess, the blood? I know they're supposed to clean the sidewalks and stuff like that after someone is shot. And I'll never forget her quizzical look back at me as her eyebrows wrinkled. And she implied incredulously, she said, they cleaned it up. And then she shook her head and she replied, no, we cleaned it up. What she revealed is a common practice among Black women in close proximity to the streets and ensuing bloodshed, that in the face of violent structural disinvestment, Black women are not only tasked with the unequal burden of loss, but also the unequal labor of managing that loss as community residents and leaders. So Black women, particularly low-income Black women, clean up the actual and figurative mess of gun violence in their communities every day. So I examined this profound context of homicide survivorship in projects spanning several cities. In Wilmington, Delaware, we've collected over 1,000 surveys and 150 plus in-depth interviews from street identified Black women and girls involved in various forms of illegal activity. We use a community engaged methodological framework called Street Participatory Action Research, or Street PAR, as was mentioned, which targets or which includes the target population in each phase of the research process, from developing research questions to data analysis to, all the way through to action-based interventions. More recently, we've expanded this work to Philadelphia, Brooklyn, New York, and Detroit under the National Cooperative on Gun Violence Research. In Philadelphia, for example, we've collected over 200, 20-page surveys from high-risk Black youth who have used or carried a gun in the last year. These youth truly represent both sides of the spectrum, as many are both victims and perpetrators of violence. And I've also examined homicide survivorship ethnographically in Boston, Massachusetts, with a nonprofit that serves Black mothers who have lost children to either homicide, incarceration, or both. Thematically, what we found in each of these cities is that street-identified Black women who survive homicide navigate profound social vulnerability while juggling the weight of unjust systems. They walk a tightrope of risk and resilience. And their cultural grief and mourning practices as Black American women operate in tandem with a form of tenacious strength that cannot be understated. It's as one street-identified Black mother explained to me. She said, to me, I have to be a strong Black woman for me and my family, because I'm the one that buried my children. So I have to take care of them no matter if the dad is there or not. I'm the head of household. They exert unimaginable physical, socio-emotional, and effective labor to tend to their families and communities. And they are truly the collective glue in their neighborhoods. But this is a complicated relationship, as the human experience is always both and. Street-identified Black women often or kind of often on multiple sides of urban violence. And at times, they are simultaneously involved in the de-escalation and escalation of violence. And this has important implications for how we understand the collateral consequences of Black homicide survivorship. For example, I'm currently working on a paper that explores how developmental timing or period of homicide-related loss shapes how Black homicide survivors view police, attitudes towards violence, and attitudes towards snitching. And what we're finding is that street-identified Black men and women who lose loved ones during childhood and adolescence are significantly more likely to endorse both engaging in violence when deemed necessary and not cooperating with police than those who lose loved ones during adulthood. Our findings suggest that when the childhood of Black youth is ruptured by violent loss, this loss has collateral implications for their cultural orientations towards the law or legal cynicism. This loss also has other implications for the potential of retaliatory violence, as these homicide survivors have stronger endorsement of using violence for protection, safety, and survival. And wrapping up, at the macro level, right? Until we address the complex social determinants of health that shape assaultive violence, we will struggle to reduce the prevalence of Black homicide survivorship. So this includes investing in quality economic opportunity in distressed Black communities to support co-victims and reduce gun violence more broadly. Economic investment necessitates that we address the racial wealth gap in this country and the systematic oppression of Black Americans. At the micro level, we should offer more comprehensive trauma-informed services for homicide survivors, such as grief support and counseling, therapy, conflict mediation, and hospital-based violence interventions. In some cities, there are little to no resources for crime victims. Most Black homicide survivors do not seek therapy or grief support following their traumatic loss, sometimes due to barriers in access, and other times due to stigma associated with therapy. So closing the gap in access and stigma of these services can potentially mitigate retaliatory violence, self-harm, and aggression. In addition, incorporating gun safety classes into diversion programs for first-time illegal gun carriers is also a way to potentially reduce unintentional shootings. Unintentional shootings are most common in Black communities. Black males ages 20 to 34 and Black females ages 0 to 19 are at the highest risk of dying from an unintentional shooting relative to other groups. More gun safety training, specifically learning how to safely store guns, can potentially reduce these injuries among youth and other high-risk individuals. And finally, it is critical to collaborate with local communities and grassroots organizations on violence reduction efforts, rather than relying solely on law enforcement strategies. We cannot police our way out of the crisis of gun violence in Black communities. And truth be told, no one is more concerned about gun violence or community violence more generally than those most affected in distressed communities. We need their voices at the table. Utilizing participatory and community-engaged research methods aids in the community buy-in and rapport needed to access hard-to-reach populations. So of course, this requires grant funders, research institutions, and policymakers to put dollars and support behind these efforts. And lastly, I leave you with this tweet. Black Americans are a resilient people. But as Dr. CBS underscores, resilience is not a coping strategy. As Dr. CBS underscores, resilience is a coping strategy, but not a virtue. Celebrating resilience without interrogating the challenges, problems, and structural issues folks are routinely forced to confront runs the risk of idealizing the capacity to suffer. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hitchens. A ton of questions that I have, and I'm sure that many others will have in the chat. Our two speakers I know have ignited a great deal of thought about these topics, and I just want to dive into the questions right now that have been posed in the chat. And if you have not placed any of your questions in the chat, please feel free to do so now. But we'll dive into the questions. So my first question, the first question in the chat is actually directed to you, Dr. Barrie. How are you measuring the successes or failures of your Pride program?
So there are several measures. I'm frozen. Oh, okay, I'm back. So there are several measures. So Pride is the outcomes are self-efficacy. As you can see, I'm very interested in that. In their ability to understand if they think that they exert their power over something, they can complete a task. It measures the before. It's like they take a pre-test and a post-test. So at the end, we aim to reduce endorsement of stereotypical roles of Black men, which is a scale that measures this historical stereotypes of Black men and reducing their endorsement of those. There is a scale that the point is to increase collective self-esteem, so they feel better about their overall group, and their academic persistence and future outlook. So those are the scales, and so we measure it by seeing if from pre-test to post-test. So they take the pre-test before we give them the intervention, and then at post-test again, and we measure the youth against themselves to see if they've made significant changes on those outcomes. So that's how we're measuring it.
Great. Thank you for that response. There's an additional question for you, Dr. Barrie. In terms of the recruitment for your study, do you want to use Black men and boys from immigrant communities as well, or just African Americans?
Just African American. So the father should be at least a first-generation American born and raised individual, because we know diasporic men have other kind of like norms and historical backgrounds that would impact the results. So we're looking for, in essence, Black American men and their Black American sons. And they don't have to be a father. It can be a grandfather or uncle, just somebody who's considered a primary caretaker and passes messages about manhood on to a young man.
Great, thank you. All right, Dr. Hitchens, because this is going to be a conversation. So I have a ton of questions lined up for you. So be ready for an engaging conversation. So Dr. Hitchens, you mentioned vicarious trauma, and I just want to mention to both of you, excellent presentations, by the way. In terms of vicarious trauma, what symptoms of vicarious trauma are you seeing among the co-victims that are similar to what you would see among people young women who actually survived a violent firearm injury, or a young man that would survive a violent? Do you see very similar symptoms of traumatic stress?
Absolutely. It's complicated because we know the cycle of violence is such that a lot of these women have been victimized in certain ways. So they're on both sides of the direct and vicarious continuum. But I mean, of course, this complex grief, this complex PTSD that doesn't always show up in our surveys and our scales, right? Like, so I've spent a lot of time watching Black women who have survived homicide and just the ways in which they continue to like throw themselves into their community. So by way of example, really fast, two women I'm thinking of, they've survived so much. They've also been victimized, but they also have experienced a lot of vicarious trauma. They continue to attend all the funerals, right? All the meetings. They're behind the scenes helping with the food at the funerals. And so I say all this to say, right, they're exhibiting some of the same mental health outcomes that we see related to both victims and our direct and vicarious victims, right? But there's a way in which Black women just throw themselves into the work, right? Despite all of that. And for me, that's the resilience piece that I feel like we often don't pick up in our studies.
And how would you, just in terms of, how would you operationalize? Because I want to shift the conversation a bit more to, like, you, even though you may not be at the point of interventions, and this question is for both of you. How would you operationalize your findings now in terms of translating that into community interventions? If you had the opportunity at this point in terms of what you found in your studies. I know, Dr. Barrie, you've mentioned your two studies in terms of your findings, and you, Dr. Hitchens, as well. But do you have any thoughts in terms of what that would look like regarding operationalizing the results and how they could be translated into interventions?
You want to start?
Either one of you.
So pride is already an intervention. So and it came from my work with Black boys in interviewing them about some of their troubles and their challenges around manhood and masculinity and what they saw as barriers and challenges for them. These were youth in Chicago when I was living in Chicago, which is where I came from, to here. And so the curriculum was developed based on those interviews and focus groups around the challenges they were having and understanding and making sense of manhood within their identities. After the hospital-based gun violence intervention was inspired by my clinical work on gun units in hospitals, where I found it to be rather lacking in the ability to connect to families when their children were impacted by gun violence. And you know, Dr. Richardson, you've done much of this work, but I was in a lot of children's hospitals where they didn't do a good job of maintaining and getting the families connected to services, engaging the families while they had them as a captive audience. And so those two interventions kind of came from that work. So mine are already interventions.
I'll add to that and say, you know, when it comes to the vicarious stuff, we don't even really test it well. We don't measure it well. So I think first it's important to recognize that secondary and tertiary forms of victimization. So it's not just witnessing, right? But it's, you know, it's hearing about, it's learning about, right? It's seeing. So I think first we should more thoroughly measure vicarious trauma and victimization. And then coupled with that, and a lot of times when I talk to these women, they feel like there's no space for them in this conversation, right? So they feel like there seems to be, you know, resources for the men once they're shot. And as we know, most people who are shot live, but there's no sacred space for them to vent, to be, to commiserate. So as it relates to interventions, part of it could be scaling up those spaces for the women to be able to commiserate and plan. Because what I've really seen is the most effective thing is when Black women who have experienced these things get into the same room, the ideas start to flourish, right? They want to go in front of city council. They want to advocate for their loved ones. They want to fight, right, to stem the tide of violence in their communities. But in a lot of spaces, they don't feel like they have the room to do so. So it is a combination of those things.
If I may, just thinking about the vicarious trauma, clinically, I find it doesn't actually matter, right? So when working with families who experience community violence, the kids who, you know, never were injured themselves, but kind of like had to experience the vicarious trauma, they really showed up in therapy the same way that the kids who had actually been injured showed up, right? And so there's some way in like saying that it's equally as bad. When we think about even things like smoking, right? If you are a smoker and you surround people who smoke, it might even be worse for you, right? And you getting cancer and what those outcomes are like for you. And so I would say clinically, I haven't really seen much difference between how kids show up who have actually been injured versus the kids who are vicariously injured, because for them, it could be them any day. So the kind of like hypervigilance they have around injury and victimization, the ones who have been victimized have that fear and they had it before they got injured, and the kids who have it also have that same fear of injury and hypervigilance, even though they've never been injured themselves.
Indeed. So you both presented on men and women. So we're talking about intersectional identities, right? What are the similarities and then the unique differences between what you're seeing happening with men and the way that men and boys are expressing their trauma and level of resilience, and then the differences between what you may see and similarities with working with Black women?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I'm pretty specialized. I don't think I actually really have a great understanding for how young women experience those things. And I just have a really kind of like laser focus on how the boys are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not even sure I know how to answer that, but unless I read Dr. Richens' book, I think.
I would argue that in a unique way, Black women and girls, despite what they go through, are still really expected to be community pillars and leaders in an interesting way. Not to say that it's not, Black men are very important to Black communities, right? But when it comes to the mothers, the mates, the daughters, and the siblings, there's still a way in which we expect Black women to show up in this matriarchal provider role, right? It's not quite the same. It operates in a different way for Black men. So what they often do is they have to compartmentalize and push their traumas down because they have kids to raise and they have grandchildren to raise and communities to take care of. So I would say the main difference is the manifestation of the coping, and then how that feeds into the resilience, because they're still expected to take care of others, right, as it relates to their, in addition to their coping journey.
Great. So I have one more of my questions before we hop into the chat. And this question is about the two of you. How does your own positionality play a role in the work that you're doing? And can you speak to your positionality as a Black woman scholar practitioner doing work in the gun violence research space?
Good question. I'll start.
Yeah.
So I think what's interesting, Joe, is a lot of people assume that Black people who do work on other Black people, that there's some level of like, it's easier for us, so to speak, or that, it makes sense. You're Black, you study Black people, so this should just be easy, right? You collect the data, you do the survey, and that's it, right? And it's oftentimes not that at all, right? As positionality as it relates to who I am, a Black woman studying Black people, there is a way in which I can connect with Black people, but there are still levels of privilege that we must navigate, right? So in any community that I enter, I feel like I'm starting from the, ground zero. People don't know you, right? So you do have to build that trust and that rapport. And what I've realized, and I've actually shown my white colleagues this, is that it becomes a transfer of trust. So once I build this trust, right, and they trust me enough to share their intimate stories and journeys, right, I can then possibly transfer that trust to someone who's not from that community. But my point is just to say, I'll stop there. It is hard won, right? It is not easy, right? And it's very tenuous, right? So one small thing can mess up a relationship in a community.
Thank you. Dr. Barrie.
Yes, ditto. But I think that in my position, navigating that kind of the privileges that I do have is also recognizing the way in which there's ways that sometimes it doesn't matter, right? When I show up in the place and people don't know who's who from who, and that because I'm still a Black woman who has Black nephews and Black man friends and Black male neighbors, and I played that position of kind of like the insider, outsider, privileged in some areas, but sharing the areas that are not privileged. And it just makes it also a tenuous walk for me. And to your point, particularly the part about the relationships being, I feel like even more fragile, because I feel like there's a way in which the people expect more from me. When I do enter and join into the communities and I do that work, they very much expect more from me. Yep. And there's a way in which they might be less forgiving if there's a reason why I can't show up the way they want me to. And so there's a pressure that I feel like I walk a lot of times. And some of it might be self-imposed because I also put pressure on myself, but also from the community and like, okay, sis, you're here, we're gonna let you in and you know what it is. So we expect from you. So yes, it's a thing.
And I'll add, we just have to remain teachable, right? Like we go into these communities with some type of, we've done this work, we kind of know some of the things we'll find, but to remain teachable and let the community actually tell you where the issues are and what the solutions are.
And that's become most evident for me because I started this work in Chicago and I lived there for so long, and there was a way in which I kind of got to learn as I grew as a graduate student. And now I've moved here and it's a whole new community. Violence here doesn't even work the same. Like in having to learn all of those things from zero, having to try to make community collaborations. People are like, and you are, right? Having to do that all over again and be teachable because I have to learn what's happening here before I can show up with my, interventions and my whatever. So absolutely we need to teach.
So before we pivot to the next question, I want to dovetail on that point you just made, Dr. Barrie. Can both of you explain just on the front end the challenges with developing those relationships in qualitative research? Because I think there's often the expectation when you're engaging in community engaged research and you're doing qualitative work that there should be the production of at least preliminary findings very quickly. When often on the front end, you're engaging in communities for months at a time, even maybe up to a year before you even begin to even collect data. Can the both two of you address that?
So accurate. That last point in particular, that you literally have to put in a substantial amount of work in the community before you can even collect your first survey and/or interview. And so what that requires is real time on the ground in these neighborhoods, showing up at the things that will not get you tenure, right? Showing up at the community meetings, taking phone calls, right? Being visible, trying to help where you can is literally the foundation. And so just by way of an example, right, it's a tenuous relationship. So if you're working with a nonprofit, for example, they need to see and feel you. And that means different things to different people. And so coming as your authentic self, I think, is very important. And that goes beyond race, right? Whoever you are in these communities, showing up as your authentic self, people can sniff that out and ascertain whether you're genuine. Right? But putting in that foundational work requires months, oftentimes, before you're able to actually collect any data. And I'll say, and I'll stop, it's also not just after the data collection, then what do you do then, right? Are you in these communities or did you just pay everyone and leave, which is often what we do. So it's spending real time in the communities even after data collection.
Thank you, Dr. Hitchens.
I don't have anything to add. Just a long time.
You say ditto to everything.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the pride intervention at the high school here that I'm implementing, I started this semester, but I've been working with that administrator since last April was when I first made contact with him. And it didn't start until this semester.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I want to get Dr. Kessel in. He has a question, and then I will move to the question by Dr. LaFree. Dr. Kessel.
First, thank you both for two extraordinary presentations. I mean, one of the things that indeed is challenging in this, as it was characterized, nightmare, is understanding root causes. And really, you know, as a pediatrician, prevention is really the hallmark of pediatrics. And what I want to ask a little bit about is I have the privilege of interacting with families fundamentally from birth, when the child is born. And I'm curious about your thoughtfulness about taking what you have learned through your incredibly rigorous, thoughtful science and how it can be applied early in the life cycle, how it can be applied as in the formative years of seeing children and frankly with their families, however family is defined in those days. I'm just thinking about extrapolating and building on a question Joe asked earlier about operationalizing some of the tenets that you've seen and how I, as a pediatrician, as another vehicle for an intervention, could apply some of these kinds of things that you have observed. I mean, one of the main changes in pediatrics has moved from looking only at the individual, but family-centeredness and looking at families in context, looking at social determinants of health. I know it's a big question, but your thoughtfulness could potentially be applied early in the growth and development of Black children.
And it truly must be, right? So even what we're seeing, right? Even what we're seeing with Black homicide survivors, right? So Black folks who lose a loved one in childhood or adolescence, right? They end up having stronger pro-violence attitudes, are less likely to cooperate with police than if they lose someone later in life. And so what that suggests to me is like the interventions on the front end. Sometimes we don't think about that 10-year-old, right, who has lost his brother or his even close friend, right? And what we're creating if we don't have these kind of systematic interventions in place. And so it behooves us, I would say, right, on the front end, right, young people who are living in these communities and experiencing loss at a very young age, right, that they see or have the resources available to them. Now, I'm not a clinician, so Rabbi, jump in here in that sense, but in my mind, right, sometimes we miss the mark and we start a little bit too late. So we start to try to intervene once that young person already has the gun, right? But thinking about earlier on, like, what did he see when he was 8? What did she see when she was 7? And then what that then creates.
Yeah, I would argue that we're always in a place of intervention, tertiary. The history of America makes it that we are starting at a place of intervention always. There's really nothing to prevent at this point because the narratives exist. And there are a lot of systems that engage in perpetuating the narratives. And the best places where kids spend the most times are the places that are the most violent towards our kids, i.e. school, right? So how do we change school systems, train teachers, right? These places where our kids go every day and their identity development is impacted. To Brooklyn's point, a lot of people think about identity development as happening in adolescence. Identity development actually really starts around middle childhood, right? So if you think about like a 10-year-old and you ask a 10-year-old who they are, they start telling you what they're good at. I'm good at this, I'm bad at that, I'm good at this, I'm bad at that, right? That's how they start to think about themselves very early on. So very early on, they're learning these narratives about who's good and who's bad, and the bad people are always them. We are already at a place of intervention, right? And so the work to be done is how do we change narratives and systems, particularly the ones that our kids come in contact with the most, schools, neighborhoods, media. Other than that, we're always going to be in a place of intervention because they're out there in the historical and the intergenerational. And so it's hard to start at the beginning because there is no more beginning.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we have 8 minutes. So we'll try to squeeze in the next three questions in 8 minutes. Dr. Lafree, this question is directed to you, Dr. Hitchens. In hearing your presentation, I thought back to the classic work of Elijah Anderson's Code of the Street. This book is now 25 years old. Do you think it still holds up as an important statement about violence in the moral life of large cities?
That's a great question. I feel like Gary and I have talked about it briefly. Code of the Streets. First, I'll say, I know it's a book in criminology that has stood the test of time. It's a very popular book. I'll say this, though. I think a lot of actual Black folks take offense to a lot of which that Elijah Anderson asserts and claims. And so for one, if I'm focusing on here just on Black women alone, I think a lot of his framing of Black women and girls in Code of the Streets does not quite match with the reality of their experiences. And so I would say, specifically related to the experience of Black women and girls, the chapter on the mating game and things of that nature doesn't quite match on or latch on to what's actually happening in low-income Black communities. I would argue that Code of the Streets is a bit of an incomplete picture. So yes, there are codes of violence in low-income Black communities, but I would say, what about the other side of it too, right? So what about the street love, the bonding, the resilience, the ways in which Black people marry the two, right? So it's more than codes of violence in these neighborhoods. So that is part of it, but it's more than that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Hitchens. One more question for you, Dr. Hitchens. Can you speak to the sexualization of Black women in the media, music, TikTok, movies, etc., and how it may impact their victimization and how that may be addressed at a societal level?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. I'm a little bit beyond the scope, but still something I think I can speak to. I think all of that sexualization is a racial project. And what I mean by that is it's a way in which the media in particular, right, can then skew our understanding of the behavior and the worldviews of Black women and girls, right? And so, some people talk about like institutional plants or media plants, right? But beyond that, I feel like the racial project is creating in our mind that Black girls are sexual, Black girls cannot be hurt, Black girls are vindictive and evil, and this podcast culture that we're in. And so as it relates to it being a racial project, what it obscures is the actual reality and the inequities that they face. And so we are so focused on this side of it, right? But we then neglect the real trauma that some of them experience.
Thank you. This next question is directed to the both of you. Dara Blockman Demner asks, thank you. First, she states, thank you for these fascinating and important presentations. I'm wondering if either speaker could share thoughts about the integration of their work. I'm thinking about violence prevention broadly. HVIPs and street outreach programs are typically male-focused and often center on certain ideas of manhood and victimhood and are seen as completely separate from IPV prevention. Yet both of your work points to how integrated they are and could speak to opportunities for innovative prevention efforts. What are your thoughts?
A big question. On the manhood part, what I'll say is, yes, I agree. A lot of these programs are male heavy. Even my experience with Street PAR, these are male heavy typical organizations, right? But the projects that I have been on that include women, I would argue, it is the combination of Black men and Black women, right? As it relates to street outreach. Those are the strongest projects that I've been on, because you're getting that synergy, you're looking at, gender differently. And so those projects are the ones that I think will flourish, the most as it relates to joining in both Black men and women. The IPV part continues to be a real issue. We know that Black women are, experiencing IPV at really alarming rates. I would argue, as I said in the beginning, that's only part of it, right? IPV is a very important part, but it also is, some women are also involved in the violence as well. So it is both and. Seeing women's behavior from that both and lens, right, is really the best way to get under or tackle their experiences with violence.
Yeah. In my work, because I'm focused on how men are socialized, and so I actually do spend a lot of time with the young men in the Pride curriculum. There's a whole module about healthy relationships and kind of like unpacking those narratives around how manhood is related to women and the anti-femininity, the androgyny, and like understanding those things and how they interact, and some of the scripts they have about women. And so that's part of it. But then also thinking about, again, how traumatic stress manifests itself through the lens of manhood, and how the people who are in their sphere, right, can end up being the people who take, like the women who clean up, right, the traumatic stress experiences that they have, and when they exhibit their symptoms, what does that look like? And the people who are closest to them are most likely the people who are going to be the victims of the expression of their traumatic stress and what that means and what it's supposed to look like when you're a man. So definitely in that work. And, Dr. Hitchens and I, we just, she just don't know I'm going to come snatch her. We're going to be together. So work and try to find that synergy and integration, because it's important for the whole.
I love the fact that both of you are talking about collaboration. This may be the last question. We have 2 minutes left, so I may not be able to get to the final question, and I can forward those questions to both of you. One of the participants asked, I often wonder why gun violence versus mass violence are viewed differently. The victim's needs are the same regardless if they are a victim of gun violence versus mass violence. The response is not the same. Why?
I actually just got off a Zoom call with a bunch of other community violence researchers about the same thing, right? And so someone, I don't remember who said it on the call, pretty poignantly said, because white people care about mass shootings, right? This is why there's this attention to mass shootings that is different than the attention that we give to urban gun violence. And so what we're really doing is that we're grossly misrepresenting data. Like, we're grossly misrepresenting who's at risk for victimization, right? So mass shooting is that like less than 1% chance, right? But you have these entire communities that are experiencing, real victimization in a different way, that we don't talk about. Suicide is also something we don't talk about in our framing of mass shootings. So mass shootings dominates the airways, right? But it does represent the smallest portion of gun violence in our communities.
Dr. Barrie, do you care to
Yeah,
close?
I don't have much to add, just that, you know, gun violence meets the standard for mass incarceration. Like, I mean, not mass incarceration, mass shootings, like what is considered a mass shooting happens in pretty much in most gun violence situations. But the word mass shooting triggers like funding, like federal government funding, that gun violence does not. And so they start classifying our community violence as mass shootings. They don't have to start putting that money into the community and the programming and FEMA and everybody else to come help. And they're not prepared to do that. Hence the dehumanization and focusing on the gun and not the mass, which is talking about people and human lives.
Thank you. Excellent way for us to close. I just want to say the amazing presentations. I'm so proud that the two of you are gun violence researchers at the University of Maryland and that we have you here. If anyone wants to just give a round of applause, I don't know if that will show up in the chat, but I know I definitely will. I appreciate both of you.
Thank
Just
you.
amazing presentations and scholarship. Just a couple of notes. We will be sharing the webinar on our Progress website. So there will be a link to the webinar for those who have asked that question, and also the PowerPoint presentations will be within that presentation. So we are closing. From our perspective, this inaugural speaker series event has been tremendously an outstanding success. I would again like to thank our featured speakers, Professors Barrie and Hitchens, for sharing their groundbreaking work and lucid perspectives with us. And before closing, I would also like to thank again President Darrell Pines, Provost Jennifer Rice, Vice President Greg Ball, and Dean Susan Rivera for helping to make progress on gun violence reduction by helping to make progress this initiative. I would also be remiss if I did not acknowledge and thank my distinguished co-director, Dr. Woodie Kessel, and the members of our Progress team for their great work. And last but not least, special thanks to Progress graduate assistant, Lindsay Wood. You did an amazing job today, Lindsay, for organizing and advertising this event, and also for expertly serving as our technical moderator for today. Without any further ado, I wish everyone a great day. We will keep you up to date and in the loop for our next speakers and this speaker series, and also our other workshops and events that are coming up through Progress. Again, I thank everyone for attending. I hope that you found this a very insightful discussion today by these two amazing scholars, and more to come from Progress. Thank you all. I wish you well. Good afternoon.
Thank you.